Good evening, party people. Welcome to a nice, kind of little chilly evening in San Diego. It's a little foggy out there. You can barely see the coastline out there. A little chilly. I want to say the weather channel says it's 61. I have a hard time believing that. It feels chillier than that, as you can kind of tell by my sweater. You may also be able to tell, if you have very good ears, you may be able to tell that I have a little bit of a lisp. The reason behind that is I have Invisalign braces now. Since I plan on spending a lot more time in Mexico about a year from now, I figured now was the chance to kind of clean up my act on my teeth. So I'm getting I got Invisalign braces to kind of just clean up the lineup on the bottom and correct my little bit of an overbite. Because when you get Invisalign braces, they keep bringing you into the dentist every few weeks to make sure your progress is good. So since I'm still in the United States for at least a week a month during 2022, I figured now's the chance to go do it, just because I have a good dentist here, so it works out pretty well. So I also have a good strong gin and tonic, like a curiously strong gin and tonic. I kind of screwed up the mix on this one. So I'm probably going to give you bad answers here in a while as the night goes on. So let's go pop open your questions and go see what we've got here. So the top voted one is from FishCakesForTea, who asks, I've designed a filtered index for a specific query, but SQL Server doesn't use it unless I move the columns in the where clause into the included columns as well in the filtered index. Why do I have to do that? I don't need these columns for a select statement or a join. Oh, this is such a cool question because it's what a lot of us would consider a bug. The thing is, though, and there's been a bug report for it for years in Microsoft Connect and then later in Azure Feedback. If you think about an execution plan having a whole bunch of operators in it, what you want is when the filtered index is operated on, it's like an index seek directly into that. SQL Server gets the rows that it needs and then it's done. But here's the thing. What if, due to the way that SQL Server built the execution plan, it needs those columns later in the execution plan, even if you don't need them in the output? Let's say, for example, that your filtered index was on coupon amount, and you had in your filter, you only wanted sales where coupon amount was 0, and you had that in your filtered index. But for some reason, there was a group by involved, and it was checking that the coupon amount was 0 during the group by. Well, SQL Server is going to need to do all this summing later on in the query plan after the index seek. So it needs that filtered index type data somewhere else in the query plan. That's typically why you see that you have to include the columns. I wish there was a good workaround that didn't involve rewriting the query. Usually you can get to fixes by rewriting the query, but usually the short-term way to get across the finish line is just to include the columns in the index. None of us are happy about that, but it's been an issue in Microsoft Feedback for maybe a decade, and Microsoft hasn't done anything about it. So there you go. Even if they did something about it, it would be in SQL Server like 2022. And so that doesn't do you a lot of good right now. Next up, let's see here. Oh, I got to reload the page because I let that time out. Hold on a second here. Let me go pop this open and then hit you. Next up, come on, do the flag thing. There you go. Someone who is a Smiths fan, as I am, someone called HeavenKnowsIAmMiserableNow, says, sometimes I tune a query and the logical reads are lower, but duration is higher even after a few executions. What are the likely causes, and is using reads as a performance yardstick misguided? So here's the thing. Reads is usually a good metric, but it's not the only metric. And I'm going to give you a very simplified example. What if on an early version of your query, SQL Server needed to do enough work that it decided to go parallel, but after you tuned it, SQL Server decided there was only enough work to go single-threaded, so reads could have gone down, but maybe other parts of your query were trying to do so much CPU work that they needed to go parallel. If your main goal is tuning for duration, the first thing to look at is what's taking so much time. And typically what you find in situations like this is that there's something very CPU intensive about the query. I talk about how to tune those kinds of queries in my Mastering Query Tuning and Mastering Server Tuning class, but hopefully that at least gives you a good example to get started with. Logical reads is the best simple milestone to start with when you can't go to training classes. But when you find yourself hitting a bottleneck and you're like, doggone it, I've gotten logical reads really low, but I'm still having problems, that's where it's a sign that you want to go to training classes or go pick up some books about SQL Server as well. But you've hit the end of the runway for Google. Like, you're not just going to be able to Google your way out of that one and read a 30-second blog post to get the answer. Next up, NotMySelf. Goodness, hold on a second. I need a sip of my tasty beverage. NotMySelf says, "Hi Brent, what are your thoughts on the new multiple plans per query feature in SQL Server 2022? So the SQL Server 2022 was announced yesterday or today. I've already forgotten. I'm doing classes on weird hours, so my days kind of blur together. I think it was this morning. Pretty sure it was this morning. And so there was a brand new feature announced that'll let SQL Server cache multiple query plans per feature, or multiple query plans for one given query. And all it got was like a 10-second demo by Bob Ward in a video. There are no details about it yet. There's no implementation details. Typically, when you do a great job of something, you want to share all the details with someone. When you do a bad job of something, when you take a lot of shortcuts to get across the finish line quickly, you try to distract someone and be like, oh no, okay, let me tell you something else that's really cool. Or look at that whale over there. So what I'm just saying is, maybe temper your hopes for when you see the final technical details, because otherwise it looks a little suspicious to me, because here's my biggest concern. What I saw in the demo made it look like SQL Server might cache a plan for every individual parameter, and that those plans would be stored in Query Store. If you've read my blog posts about Query Store in the past, you'll know that there are a lot of barriers to adoption for Query Store, and one of the classic barriers to adoption is when you have a whole bunch of different unique query plans because people don't parameterize their queries. If you have a workload that consists of mostly unparameterized queries where people are dumping all kinds of literals into their queries, that is one of Query Store's kryptonite, where it just can't cache enough query plans, especially with a relatively limited amount of drive space. So I would be really suspicious of that, and I'm excited to see how they finally end up shipping it. But my worst nightmare would be that they store an execution plan for every parameter in Query Store, and it's set at the database level. Your Query Store will quickly become useless due to the sheer quantity of plans. Next up, Alexandre Jobin asks, how can you know if your SQL Server is over-provisioned or under-provisioned? We're planning to go to the cloud and we're questioning the server specs. Okay, how do you know if your queries are fast enough? Like with numbers, how do you know if your queries are fast enough? If you can give me an answer to that, then I can tell you numerically how you can tell if your server is over-provisioned or under-provisioned. If your queries are fast enough, Then you could numerically scale down the amount of horsepower involved in SQL Server until the queries were fast enough but no faster than that. And that is pretty hard to do. One way that I talk about doing it in my Mastering Server Tuning class is with the wait-time ratio metric. And if you Google for Brent Ozar wait-time ratio, I've got a blog post out about there publicly about it that's totally free. And in there, I talk about how you can use a ratio of how much time per hour that SQL Server waits. And if it's not waiting at all, if it's sitting around bored, that's a good sign that you've got more horsepower than you need. But of course, the trick is that you have to size for your peak workloads. If you have peaks Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, wait time ratio overnight isn't going to tell you anything. You have to look at your worst case scenario for wait time ratio. The other really cheesy way to think about it is back down horsepower until people start screaming, and then you turn up horsepower until they stop screaming. It's kind of a flip answer, but there you go. This is good gin. Yeah, gin and tonic, Roku gin. Next up we have Bob the Builder. I like that name, that's good. Bob the Builder says, "Hi Brent, my friend has a table with 18 million rows with no primary key or no clustered index. However, they have 6 non-clustered indexes, a few on nullable and nvarchar columns. Is it advisable to change one of the indexes to a clustered index for better performance, even though they're having duplicate values?" You know, I hate to give an answer like this, but here's the thing. I spend about an hour in my Mastering Index Tuning class about the times when heaps are appropriate, the times when heaps are not appropriate, and then when your heap isn't appropriate and you want to add a clustered index, how you go about picking the right columns for your clustered index. Man, I wish I could boil that down to a 30 to 60 second answer. But if I could, I wouldn't spend a whole hour teaching it in my Mastering Index Tuning class. So that's a good sign that it's time for you to think about those kinds of classes. But here's one thing I might start with by asking. 18 million rows isn't all that big. In my demos, in my classes, I use the 10 million row users table at Stack Overflow, and it's only like 1 gig in size. So I don't know whether that's really big data for you or not, and I don't know if end users are complaining about performance on that table. If they're not complaining about performance on that table, I might leave that alone, because 18 million rows, it's not really all that large. However, if they are complaining about performance, that's where things like my Mastering Index Tuning class come in. And it just so happens that class is on sale this month. If you go check out brentozar.com/Black Friday, running a sale all November long on my training classes. So there you go. Next up, DrDrakken asks, I recognize that name. I've answered one of your questions recently. My friend's database has tables with a lot of columns. Okay, seriously, y'all have to stop using the terms like a lot or large, because what's a lot to you may not be a lot to somebody else. Just put numbers in behind it. It's kind of like going out on a date and telling your friend, I can go for a really long time, and I'm really large. We both know that's not really true, right? Especially your friend does. They told me. DrDrakken continues on. This table has a lot of columns. For reasons this is not to be changed in an easy way. Is the rule of a max 5 indexes per table still valid? No, wait, hold up. That's not a rule. In my Mastering Index Tuning class, I say there's a guideline of around 5 indexes per table and around 5 columns per index or less. And when you go above that, you have to understand the consequences. And I talk about those consequences in the Mastering Index Tuning class. Consequences include blocking. because the more columns that you have in each index and the more indexes that you have, the longer each insert, update, and delete can take, because we got to grab locks across all of these objects. Your database becomes larger, your backup times take longer, your index rebuilds take longer, your update stats jobs take longer. But there can be situations where that doesn't matter, and it kind of sounds like I'm joking, but bear with me for a second. What if the database is read-only? If the database is read-only, you're probably not concerned about blocks. You're probably not concerned about backup times or index rebuild times, because nothing's changing inside the database. So in the Mastering Index Tuning class, we talk about how to make those compromises, how to know when 5 and 5 is too low, how to know when 5 and 5 is too much. I give demos where even just one index on one column brings the SQL Server's workload to its knees. So there you go. Next up we have UseLessFellow. UseLessFellow, there we go. He capitalized the U and the L, so it kind of confused me a little there. UseLessFellow says, I'm excited to join in the class, but at the same time, one of your suggestions about getting a certification is useless because it doesn't provide any job opportunity. Oh, we don't do certifications. Like, my classes are not about certifications at all. He says, if that's the case, after your course is done, what opportunities will you provide? And please provide a path. Oh, no. Don't think that you're going to get a job just because you're waving around a receipt from my class. I give you a completion certificate, but you could be a moron. You might have sat in that class and not picked up a damn thing. Their certificate even says, congratulations so-and-so for sitting through and possibly even staying awake through whichever the class is. But I don't certify that you know anything. And I'm sure as heck not giving you a job after you finish those classes. If you think that you're getting a job because you got some SQL certification, I would go ask Microsoft, what jobs are you going to give me once I finish this certification? There ain't no free lunch there. Now, having said that, what I hear from some of the students is that their ability to get their job done faster, especially the people who work for consulting companies, accelerates when they go through my classes. And I also hear from consulting companies that they put their own staff through my classes because it helps them be better consultants faster. So if you're looking to either become a freelancer or work for a consulting company, having the completion certificate helps. But I'll be the first person to tell you, it's up to you to actually learn stuff in the class. Writing the check doesn't get you across the finish line. I'll tell you something else too. There's a good percentage of my customers who I call collectors, that they buy everything I produce, but they don't go to the classes. It's true. You would think that they would go and attend every class that they possibly could, but there are some people who just write the check for the class, so to speak, and then they never actually go because work gets busy, work gets in the way, or they decide they have other priorities, and then they don't actually attend. They don't learn anything. So it's up to you to put some skin in the game there too. Next up, we have Peter Sawatzki, who asks, hi Brent, would you put tempdb files on unmirrored storage volumes or on unmirrored SSDs? Oh, sure. It all comes down to what your tolerance for outages are and what your tolerance for cheaper servers are. For example, there are a lot of cloud providers that will only give you one SSD volume, and there's no redundancy at the host level for that. But the way that you achieve redundancy, especially up in the cloud, is you have groups of SQL servers, because you assume that in the cloud, any one SQL server is going to fail anyway. Sooner or later, it's just a matter of time. And it's not just about the SSD, it's about everything else in the cloud. The network's unreliable, your Windows VMs are unreliable, etc. and so forth. So yeah, think about redundancy at a higher level there. Next up, Mordac asks, Mordac, oh, I love it. A nice inside joke there. Mordac, not that it's an inside joke, it's a public joke, but Mordac says, hi Brent, do you have any best practices for optimizing linked server query performance? No. Connect to the SQL server that has the data that you want. And it sounds like a really short answer, like I just give it on YouTube, but I give clients the same advice too. If you're hiring me to make linked server queries go faster, we're both gonna be sorry. Well, only you're gonna be sorry, because I don't have the answer to make linked server queries really quick. Go connect to the SQL server that has the data that you want. Just as a side funny thing, for when Microsoft announced SQL Server 2022, they also included this thing about Azure Synapse Link. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, this is linked servers. That's exactly what this is. This is linked servers. And people from Microsoft are gonna be like, no, 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 no. This time it's different. Just like they did with Polybase and all these other things. Like, no, 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 no. This one's smart. And I'm like, okay, all right, let's see how this goes. And then inevitably you dig deeper into it and you're like some development product manager somewhere threw a ton of work at linked servers trying to make it work again, and it just doesn't scale well. You look at the amount of servers that you need in order to solve some of these problems. They're like, well, we'll cache all of the data. Okay, how do you invalidate the cache? Well, we haven't quite figured that out yet. Like, oh, okay, all right, good luck. Good luck with that. Next up, I'm a null set says, hi Brent, love your content in your classes. Thank you, glad you like it. Asking for a friend, is there a hierarchy for which data pages SQL Server will flush out first when it needs memory for queries? Are there some pages that are more expendable than others, such as indexes that won't get used by the query? So this is interesting because when you think about flushing pages out of memory, that has nothing to do with the query that's running right now. There's an engine inside the engine called the storage engine, and it's the storage engine's job. Well, it's, oh God, this gets complicated. Okay, so if you want to learn how this works, Google for Slava Oaks, S-L-A-V-A space OKS. Slava Oaks clock hands, as in clock hands. And Slava, we used to be an engineer at Microsoft. He's moved on somewhere else. I've already forgotten. I don't think I saw where he went. Just moved recently in the last month. But he was with Microsoft for forever. Utterly brilliant. Used to write really brilliant public stuff. And he wrote about the clock hands algorithm that SQL Server uses in order to figure out which data pages to flush based on how recently they've been touched and what they've been touched by. So that's Slava Oaks clock hands. And then you can learn about that. The only thing I'd caution you with is I remember I read it probably 10, 15 years ago, and I was like, this is amazing. And then I promptly forgot it because I have no practical use for it and I can't influence it. I do love learning stuff like that, but it's just, you know, you're going to forget it too as you get old and gray and as you drink gin and tonics. You know, I guess it's kind of like SQL Server's own clock hands, right? Your brain has to make room for other things that are more valuable, like the good ratio between gin and tonic is really like 1 to 2, 1 part gin, 2 parts tonic. And unfortunately, I think I went 2 and 2 on this one, or 1 to 1, I suppose you would say. Next up, we have the SQL Guy who says, hey Brent, let's say you have a query. Let's not. It's late at night. Why do I have to do these things? It's not really, it's only 6:39. Let's say you have a query that interjoins the orders table twice using different columns so different indexes are used. When you look at the plan, there's a troublesome key lookup. How do I know which index I should modify to get rid of the key lookup? Oh, what a cool question. Okay, so the answer will depend on whether or not SQL Server needs the data from both indexes. Or what if, let's say, one of the joins was not exists? Like SQL Server's looking for the data from one index, but wants to make sure that the other one doesn't exist. In that case, you would want to use the index that it's using to say that it does exist. If it's checking to see that both of them exist, like it's joining them together, then I don't think it really matters which one that you use. You could use either one. I would look to see if there are other queries that would benefit from adding the columns to the index. The one thing I would say, though, is key lookups get a really bad reputation. Key lookups aren't that bad when you're doing less than like 1,000 or 2,000 of them. If you're doing 1,000 or 2,000 of them, they're not really that big of a deal, because it's usually easier to do that than it is to make your indexes god-awful wide in order to cover all the different columns that you need in the query. If you find yourself doing more than 1,000 or 2,000 key lookups, then I start to question, why are we pulling back so many rows in the query? I see people writing reports or web pages and they're like, I want all the rows. And I'm like, really? Are you going to render a web page with 5,000 rows in it? No? You're going to paginate it? Well, then if you're paginating it, you're only doing like 100 key lookups, or worst case scenario, 1,000 key lookups if you have 1,000 rows on a page. Who the hell cares about 1,000 key lookups? It's easier to do that than it is to make your indexes god-awful wide. A sip of this guy, right? Every now and then, from time to time, you might hear a thunderous roar. And there are two causes for thunderous roars down here, just as a separate side note. One is airplanes taking off from San Diego's airport. I'm really close to the airport here, and I can watch planes taking off and landing. The other cause is trains. There's a train station down below me. Well, the station is kind of nearby, but there's a set of train tracks down below me, and I can watch trains going by too as well. Planes, trains, and automobiles, I guess I have right here on the balcony. Next up, we have Doug. Doug says, on average, after becoming a DBA, how long does a person experience imposter syndrome? Is it like 1 to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, or it never goes away? Oh, this is such an interesting question. I don't think it ever goes away, but I know that, because like I will still, throughout your career, you're always going to be learning from smarter and smarter people. You're going to be going to conferences, you're going to be meeting more people, and you're always going to be looking up to people smarter than you. And eventually you're going to hit a point in your career where you're networking with people who write databases, whether they work for Microsoft or Postgres contributors or Oracle, whatever. And you're going to be like, oh my God, Andy Pavlo, who has this killer Carnegie Mellon YouTube series. And you just look up at these people and you're like, oh my God, I'm such an imposter compared to those people. It never goes away because you're always looking up at people who know more than you do. That's the case for me. I still totally feel like an imposter. But the thing that eases that for me is when I get up on a stage and I teach something and I see people taking notes. If I teach someone, and it doesn't matter if it's in person or if it's virtual, people are like in virtual, like, oh my God, that's amazing. But when people take notes, it's like, oh, okay, I know something that someone else doesn't know. It's not that I'm at the position where I want to be. It's not that I've crossed the finish line, but I'm doing okay. I'm able to pass things on to help others. Teaching other people is a huge reward there. If you're not in the kind of career where you want to go teach other people, if like you've decided that that just isn't important for you, and I respect that, it's not everybody's cup of soup. Then the way that will help you is if you sit in like my public webcast or anybody's public webcast and you watch the level of questions that come in from other people. Sooner or later, there are going to be questions where you're like, how do you not know that yet? And they don't know that yet because they haven't hit the level in their career that you've hit. That should alleviate some of the imposter syndrome, but it never goes away. I still totally feel like an imposter. Period. End of story. I was going to elaborate there, but no, I totally still do. Next up, Stranger in the Night says, hi Brent, longtime listener, first time caller. Who does the drawings of you that we see when you post? He is an artist, a professional illustrator by the name of Eric Larson. There are two professional illustrators named Eric Larson. But if you Google for Eric Larson artwork and you look at their websites, you'll see my pictures in the portfolio of the Eric Larson that we used. You'll also see illustrations that he's done of Kendra Little, Eric Darling, other people in the past who were also employed by the company. But brilliant artist, fantastic illustrator, does all kinds of different styles as well. He's also available to hire, like he'll draw illustrations of you, in not just in our style, but in other styles too. And you can see from his portfolio what some of the other styles are. Don't quote me on what the cost is, but I'm gonna guess, if I remember right, it's like $300 to $700 per illustration, depending on the complexity, because some illustrations are way more complex than others, like if I have a pattern on my sweater or things like that. All right, next up we have Geo asks, who is the Brent Ozar of Postgres? I don't actually know, and people ask me that all the time about the Brent Ozar of Postgres, the Brent Ozar of MySQL, and the Brent Ozar of Oracle, and I just don't know. I don't know that there's any one person in these other database industries that does, I'm going to totally sound vain here for a second, and I just don't care. Any one person in those other industries who publishes 3 blog posts a week, does at least a video per week, maintains an open source script library, does training classes, does consulting. I don't know anybody who's that dedicated to one product and gives that much away for free. There's me tooting my own horn. Do I know people in other platforms who do a lot of consulting? Yes. Who do a lot of training? Yes. Who give things away for free? Yes. But when you put all those together, I'm kind of weird in our industry to be like that. As far as I know, I'm kind of weird in other database industries as well. I'm just kind of weird, period. It's about the end of that. That's probably a good place to end our questions for the night. There are still a bunch of questions inside here, but what I think I'm going to do is I'll stop this video here, and then I'll start up another video and just keep working through these, because I still have some gin and tonic left, and we'll go see what happens. So I'll stop this video here, and then I'll just hit record again, and then we'll keep right on going. So I will see y'all in the next office hours. Adios.